They called her a desk jockey, a clipboard soldier, the kind of recruit who could quote the manual word for word but would freeze the second a round cracked through the air. From the moment she stepped into the barracks, they had a name for her: paper soldier. Not out loud, of course. Not when she was within earshot. But the smirks, the side glances, the barely suppressed laughter, those told the story well enough. She wasn't bulky like the rest. Didn't wear that easy swagger that came from years in the field. Her boots were always shined too perfectly. Her bunk was made with hospital corners that looked like they belonged in a brochure. When she spoke, her voice was clear, direct, and dangerously professional, too polished for most. Guys who'd seen blood, real blood, rolling down their sleeves in the middle of nowhere didn't care much for someone who looked like she just walked out of an army recruiting ad. Especially not someone who had no visible scars to prove her place. It didn't help that she kept to herself. She wasn't there to make friends, and she made that clear early on. She listened, observed, always watching with that sharp stare that made some uneasy. But when you tried to talk to her, she'd nod, say the right thing, and move on. No bravado. No nonsense. Just business. To them, that read as weakness. Cold. Detached. Fake. They tested her in small ways, making her carry more gear on drills, doubling her assignments, calling her out in front of the squad. Nothing too obvious, just enough to press and prod, to see if she'd crack or complain, or worse, go running to command. But she didn't flinch. She took it. Quietly. Always that same unreadable look. Even then, they couldn't bring themselves to respect her. In the mess hall, they'd talk louder when she walked in, exaggerating stories about firefights and close calls. Joking about real soldiers versus the ones who only filed after-action reports. One guy even said, "She's the type who'd correct your grammar while you're bleeding out." The table roared. She walked past, tray steady, eyes forward. But what no one bothered to ask was why she was there. Why someone who could have climbed the ranks safely behind a desk had suddenly requested transfer into the most active forward unit on record. Why her file was sealed tighter than most. She'd already seen more than most of them had. Just not in the way they expected. It started during her second deployment, somewhere off-grid. She wasn't just pushing paper. She was collecting intelligence firsthand. Embedded, out in the field, dressed like a local, translating, tracking, intercepting. But those records, blacked out, because the ops were quiet, surgical, classified. She'd seen villages turn to dust, had watched allies burn, had pulled 2 bodies from under rubble with her own hands. But she never talked about it. That silence they took for softness. When she was reassigned to the new base, the mocking nickname followed. The younger ones picked it up fast. Paper soldier. It was catchy. Rolled off the tongue. But the funny thing about paper, it can cut. And nobody ever sees it coming. She didn't push back. Didn't argue. Just trained harder. Fired longer. Memorized maps until she could draw them in her sleep. Every night, while the others laughed in the lounge, she studied terrain reports, enemy patterns, radio chatter. And then there was the wrist. They noticed it one day during PT. A black band always covered it. Tight, oddly positioned. She never took it off. Not even in the showers. Some said it was a tattoo, maybe something soft like a quote or a flower. But one day, one of them caught a glimpse of the ink. Just for a second. He didn't say much after that. Just sat a little quieter during meals. Nodded differently when she passed. And slowly the whispers began to shift. They dropped her in hostile territory with no fanfare. Just another body off the bird, lugging gear through the dust, boots swallowing the silence like a slow drumbeat. It was her first official combat assignment, at least, the first one where there'd be witnesses, ranks, and a command log. The heat was unforgiving, the wind bone dry, and the mission brief barely covered the real danger. They gave her the usual rundown: escort, intel, stay sharp. But the squad she was embedded with? They gave her something else entirely: doubt. The kind you can feel radiating from the eyes on your back, the kind that seeps into the pause after every order, the quiet chuckles when no one thinks you're listening. She said nothing. Did what she was told. Took her position. The patrol was supposed to be clean. A recon sweep through a border village that intelligence claimed had gone cold, no movement, no comms, just empty shells of buildings and the lingering smell of ash. But the second they stepped past the main road, something felt off. Not visibly wrong, no tripwires, no shadows darting between walls, but something in the air shifted. Tense. She felt it. The weight. The stillness. The point man shrugged it off. The others chalked it up to nerves. She kept scanning, hands steady, grip tight on her weapon. No trembling, no sweat in the eyes. She'd been here before, just not with this patch on her shoulder. Then the first shot cracked. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't meant to scare. It split the air like a whip and the man beside her folded before he could react. Chaos exploded in every direction. Shouts, gunfire, metal pinging against stone. She didn't duck. Didn't freeze. She moved. Instinct kicked in, not training. She dropped to a crouch, identified the direction, and fired 3 clean rounds before the others even got to cover. The rifle became an extension of her breath-controlled, deliberate. She wasn't spraying. She was selecting. 2 enemies dropped in the next 5 seconds. She was moving now, adjusting position, signaling to the team, flanking. The one who mocked her the night before was pinned behind a rusted cart. Panicking, jammed weapon useless in his hands. She reached him fast, covered his escape without hesitation. They didn't even have to call for a medic. She was already assessing the wounded, stabilizing, instructing. Her voice stayed low but firm, cutting through the panic like a scalpel. And when the second wave came, 3 figures emerging from the alley, bold, overconfident. She handled them without blinking. Center mass. Drop. Adjust. Drop. Pivot. Drop. After that, it got quiet. Not because the threat was gone, but because they were all watching her. Not one of them moved without her signal. It wasn't just the kills. It was the way she didn't flinch when blood sprayed her vest. The way she checked her corners like she'd mapped them from memory. The way she took over without ever raising her voice or stepping out of formation. When command radioed in, she gave the report. Clear, concise, objective. Not a single word about what she'd just done, no pride, no spin. Just the facts. They returned to base different. The jokes stopped. The sidelong looks were replaced with silent nods. One of the younger soldiers tried to ask her where she learned to shoot like that. She didn't answer. Just walked past, hand resting lightly on the rifle sling. That night, they sat around the fire in silence. No stories, no bravado. Just the crackle of flames and the echo of what they'd seen. Somewhere in the dark, someone whispered her name. No laughter followed. The tally marks started quietly. She didn't announce them. Didn't make it a ritual. It wasn't some dramatic moment after a firefight where she knelt and carved a line like something out of a war movie. No, it was quieter than that. Sharper. More personal. After her first confirmed kill on record, the one no one else believed she'd made, she sat alone in her bunk, rolled up her sleeve, and made a single line with black ink. Not a trophy. Not pride. Just a mark. Proof, maybe. To herself more than anyone else. A reminder that she'd crossed a line you don't come back from. They thought she kept her wrist covered because she was hiding something soft. Maybe a quote from a lover. A tattoo from her past. Something sentimental. But under the tightly wound band, the lines began to multiply. Slowly. One by one. She never marked from rage. Never in the heat of adrenaline. It always came later. When the dust had settled, the bodies were counted and the silence returned. Only then would she sit, alone, and add another line. They weren't decorations. They weren't for anyone else to see. Each one was a name she'd never know. A face she'd seen for a flicker of a second. Some were clean shots, center mass, textbook. Others were messy. Some were up close. One she had to do with a blade when everything else failed. That one shook her. The line she made that night was slower than the others. Thicker. It bled a little across her skin, just like the memory wouldn't leave her. No one ever saw her draw them. But they started to notice the count. A few caught glimpses during PT or when she was rolling up her sleeves to wash gear. The questions stopped coming. Rumors spread fast in the barracks. Some said the marks weren't even kills, they were reminders of fallen comrades. Others claimed she was keeping track of something darker. One guy swore he saw over 15 lines. Another said it was over 20. No one could confirm. But one thing changed for certain, no one laughed anymore. She wore them like a ghost story. Something half-glimpsed, half-believed. Something they whispered about late at night when the power flickered or the wind shifted outside the wire. And for every mark she added, her silence deepened. It wasn't that she was cold. She just carried something now. Something heavier than her rifle. Heavier than the armor strapped to her chest. In the field, she moved differently. Not faster, not louder, just with finality. Like she'd already measured the outcome before the first trigger was pulled. Others flinched at shots fired. She adjusted, returned fire, confirmed, and kept moving. Her kills weren't accidents. They weren't lucky. They were precise. Trained. Chosen. One soldier, new to the unit, once asked her directly. They were prepping for a recon op and he hadn't learned the unwritten rules yet. He glanced at her wrist and said, "Are those kill counts?" She didn't even look up. Just finished checking her weapon. But another guy, one who'd been on her team for months, cut in before she could reply. He just said, "You don't ask about the marks." The room fell quiet. They went out that day and took fire near the ridge. She took down 3. No hesitation. Same calm expression. Same steady hands. When they got back, she disappeared into her bunk for a while. Later that night, someone said they heard her pen cap click open. No one asked if she made another line. They just knew. She never boasted. Never claimed to be better than anyone else. She just did the job, came back, and carried the weight without sharing it. Those marks weren't for glory. They were for the ghosts. The ones that didn't leave when the sun came up. The tension in the briefing room wasn't unusual. Everyone felt it before deployment. The hushed voices, the metal clinks of gear being prepped, the tight way men stood with arms folded across their chests. But this time it wasn't the mission making the air thick. It was her. She sat near the back, calm, silent, and still as a statue. Her notepad was open in front of her, but she wasn't writing. She already knew the mission backwards. She had read the terrain maps, cross-referenced the sat feeds, even picked apart the last 3 radio transmissions from that sector. She was ready, but they weren't. One guy leaned over to another, whispering too loudly to really be private. "Hope Command sent us a rifle and not a resume this time." A couple of the younger ones laughed under their breath. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn. She'd been hearing versions of the same joke since she arrived. That she looked too clean, too soft, too composed. That maybe she belonged in HR, not on recon. They couldn't see the wrist. She kept it wrapped now with a darker band, tighter, more discreet. The old one had started to raise questions, and the questions had turned into conversations. The kind that got too close. The kind she had no interest in entertaining. The officer giving the mission rundown hesitated when he looked at her. Not because he doubted her, but because he knew the others did. He gave her the same brief as everyone else, kept it clinical, kept it even. But when his eyes caught hers, there was something else there. Not sympathy, not admiration, just understanding. Still, the room was watching her. It wasn't about what she had done. Most of them didn't know the truth. The ones who did didn't speak of it. It was about what she hadn't done. She hadn't needed them. And that unsettled people. In this room, where people measured each other by scars and stories, she offered neither. She didn't swap tales about firefights or joke about near-death experiences. She didn't take part in the backslapping or the forced camaraderie. She just showed up, locked in, did her job and left without ceremony. They mistook her silence for arrogance. One of them, Martinez, started pushing. Loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "We're not handing over leadership to someone who's barely fired her weapon outside a range." He leaned back in his chair, arms behind his head, grinning like he was just making conversation. She stood slowly, walked to the map, pointed to the ridgeline the others hadn't even mentioned yet. "There," she said flatly. "That's where we'll get hit." The room quieted. She didn't shout, didn't defend herself, just stated what she saw based on patterns, movement, tactics none of them had bothered to analyze. She pointed to the escape routes, the fallback zone, the sniping points, the blind spots in their own layout. Then she sat down again. No one laughed this time. Later, after the briefing, a few lingered. Still skeptical. Still bitter. But quieter now. Watching her more than talking. Then the mission logs from her previous deployment surfaced. Not officially, someone in logistics had done some digging. And what they found didn't match the image they had built in their heads. Over a dozen confirmed kills. 4 high-risk missions signed off by Black Ink Command. Commendations buried behind redacted memos. No press. No interviews. Just silent acknowledgments buried deep in the system. And then the story about the village. The one no one talks about. Where her unit was ambushed and she was the only one who made it out. With 3 wounded, 1 dead, and no backup. They said she carried 2 of them out on her back. Fought off attackers for over an hour. They said she didn't speak for days after. They didn't tell that story in the barracks. But everyone started walking past her with a little more space. The joke stopped. The mocking faded. But she didn't change. She still sat in the same seat, still rolled her sleeves down, still kept her eyes on the map longer than anyone else. And now, when the room fell silent, it wasn't discomfort. It was deference. The major had seen everything. 20 years in, half of them deployed, the other half writing the names of dead men into logbooks that always seemed too thin to hold the weight. He didn't flinch easy, didn't get impressed. By then, he'd already buried friends, lost squads, and seen medals pinned to caskets. His face was carved with lines that only war gives you. The kind that come from watching someone take their last breath and knowing you sent them there. So when he walked into the ops room and saw her standing there, arms folded behind her back, expression unreadable, he didn't think much of it. Another soldier, another briefing. She looked too young, too neat. Her boots were still laced in that precise crisscross way they teach in basic. The kind that disappears after your first rain-soaked patrol. He scanned the room. His eyes didn't linger, until they did. She wasn't standing like the others. She wasn't posturing, or fidgeting, or overcorrecting. She was just still, calm in a way that wasn't forced. Like she wasn't trying to prove she belonged. She already knew. That made him pause. The others shifted uncomfortably. He could feel it. The unspoken tension. The way the room bent around her presence without fully accepting it. He'd seen that before. Soldiers whose reputations arrived before they did. Soldiers who wore silence like armor. He walked toward her. Not directly, just close enough to see. Something caught his eye. She was adjusting her gloves, and for a second, the band on her wrist slipped. Just enough. The lines were there. Black, thin, uneven. Faintly faded like they'd been scrubbed and reapplied more times than he could guess. He'd seen that kind of ink before. Not as tattoos. Not for show. But as marks. Symbols. A code soldiers didn't talk about unless they were far from command. Sitting in the dark, passing a bottle and a story. He stopped. Looked at her face. Nothing there. No pride. No challenge. He didn't say a word. Just moved on, resumed the briefing. But something in his voice shifted. The tone. A subtle drop of respect. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just a recognition. After the room cleared, he called her back. They stood in silence for a moment, the room empty but still holding the heat of the people who'd just left. He didn't ask what the lines meant. He didn't need to. I read your file, he said quietly. She didn't respond. Just nodded once. He took a slow breath. They don't know, do they? Still nothing. The silence wasn't cold, it was protective. She wasn't hiding anything out of shame. She was guarding something that the others weren't ready to understand. He studied her. The way her eyes didn't shift. The way her hands stayed steady. He could see the difference now, not just in her posture, but in her presence. She carried something they couldn't name. Not just experience, but something harder. He'd seen soldiers fake bravery. Seen them wear confidence like a mask. But this wasn't that. This was earned. He asked her one question. Why did you come back? That was the only time her eyes broke from his. Just briefly. A flicker. Then she answered. To finish what I started. No emotion. No hesitation. He nodded. That was enough. From that moment on, he treated her differently. Not like a subordinate to be molded. Not like a liability to be corrected. But like someone who already knew the cost. He made sure her name was on the roster for the next joint op. Not buried. Not reassigned. Frontline. The other officers raised questions. Said she wasn't a good fit for leadership. Said she didn't have enough field command hours. Said she lacked presence. He overruled them. She's ready was all he said. And when they pushed back harder, he added one more thing. She's survived more than any of you have planned for. The whispers grew louder after that. People started connecting the dots. The quiet file transfers. The sealed orders. The missions she never mentioned. They started noticing how even the major deferred to her insight, how he asked her questions in the ops room, how he didn't just give her orders, he included her in the planning. He never explained it to the others, never told them what he saw on her wrist. He didn't need to. They used to smirk when she walked in. Not in a cruel way, at least not at first. It was more subtle than that. A glance passed between soldiers, a shared breath of disbelief. The kind of look people give when something doesn't fit the mold, when someone walks into a place built from fire and dust and doesn't look like they've ever bled on the inside of their boots. At first, it was the uniform, pressed, clean, like she hadn't earned the right to sweat in it. Then it was her silence, how she didn't join in on the banter, didn't laugh at the stories that everyone else clung to like lifeboats in a storm. She didn't play the game, didn't posture, and that made her easy to dismiss. But then came the stories. Quiet ones, half-spoken, things no one wanted to say out loud. Someone would mention a kill count. Not bragging, just confused. I don't get it. Command says she's cleared more targets than half of us combined. Others shrugged it off. Luck, they said, or paperwork errors. Still, the questions grew louder. The wristband, the long stares at the map wall, the fact that the major, the same one who'd once threatened to demote a captain for misreading terrain, was suddenly asking her opinion in front of everyone. They noticed. But it wasn't until that mission, the one where everything fell apart, that her story finally carved itself into their memory. They were supposed to take the compound at dawn. A clean operation. Minimal resistance expected. But the intel was wrong. So wrong that it was almost a setup. They walked into a death trap. Bullets rained from rooftops, doors exploded open with enemy fire, and within seconds the formation was shredded. The comms went dark. 2 team leads were down. Kaya swallowed everything. And then, through the noise, her voice broke in over the fallback frequency. Calm. Crisp. Regroup at Sector C. Now. She wasn't in command. But they listened. Not because of authority. Because of something in her voice. Something that didn't shake. She moved through that battlefield like she'd lived there. Neutralized 2 gunners before the medics could even reach the wounded. Took control of a rooftop that gave cover to the fallback team. Coordinated fire, covered the retreat, and when the final vehicle got stuck under fire, she stood between it and the enemy with nothing but her sidearm and an extra mag. She didn't retreat until everyone else was inside. The footage later showed her stepping onto the ramp last, clothes torn, face bloodied, gun smoking. No one spoke on the flight back. The next morning, the same guys who once joked about her keyboard combat stood up when she entered the briefing room. No order had been given. It just happened. Not everyone understood why. But they felt it. There was something different now. Something heavy in the air when she was around. It wasn't fear. It was respect. The kind that doesn't come from medals or ranks. The kind that only lives in people who've watched someone walk through hell with steady hands. She didn't change after that. Still quiet. Still meticulous. Still rolled her sleeves just enough to keep the ink hidden. But others changed around her. They listened when she spoke. They mirrored her calm in moments where panic once ruled. And when a new recruit laughed at her silence during orientation, he didn't get far before someone stopped him. You don't talk about her like that, they said. Why? The kid asked. The soldier looked down, took a breath, and said, because she's the reason I'm still breathing. From then on, her name wasn't passed with smirks. It was spoken with reverence. And in a place where most stories are forgotten as fast as they're lived, hers became something else entirely. A name they whispered when things got bad. A legend they didn't dare exaggerate because the truth was already more than enough.